It's lovely to highlight the wonderful work of this working group in the research series today. And sorry for the kind of chaotic start there. This is part of the issue of doing so many things back to back. But I'm really excited for the discussion.
So hello, everyone. My name is Angie Raymond. I'm the Director of Data Management and Information Governance Programs, the Ostrom Workshop. And I guess to sort of put it mildly, Greg Bloom and I have been working in this area for a considerable period of time at this point in time, when considerable in terms of tech levels of considerable, of course. And so I know Greg has some slides to share that we're going to talk about the work. This actually comes from a couple of different occurrences at the workshop, just so everyone knows. There are a couple of working groups that, this will cover. But then we also launched last year and completed a series of data salons, data trust salons as well. And so this comes from sort of, working groups that worked, quite honestly, which if you know me, I make fun of working groups because the use of the term working is often not accurate. It's not true in this case. We have, and the data salon series and the working groups between them, we were able to create a smaller group, a small but mighty group that have done some really wonderful things. So I'll let Greg introduce himself, but then also go ahead and share some of the products and stuff that we're going to give you an update on and look for some feedback on too.
Thanks, Angie. And right on, I see I've got some of my partners in the field in the room. Welcome to folks from Whatcom County and Washington and other folks there. It's so great to have people who are like doing this work, joining this somewhat academic discussion. I will actually be building off of a previous talk that I given at the Ostrom workshop. Some of you may have seen it before. I will recap the big picture and then sort of hone in on some new details. I am sharing the link to that previous talk, and I will also be referencing a couple of documents, one of which is a paper that just came out in a book published today by the Cambridge University Press, and I'm linking to that chapter, and also referencing ideas in the book. And this is what I want to get to the point where we spend much of our time on. I'll be referencing these diagrams, which will be in my deck, but you can pull these diagrams up. This is a project that came from the Ostrom workshop. Thank you, Angie, and the workshop for the support for developing these aids. And hopefully we'll have time at the end to then step all the way back out of the specific issue area that I'll be talking about and think about how we're developing some frameworks that can guide other kinds of data commons initiatives. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end of the conversation for that. So Angie, if it's all right, I can jump into my deck, some of which some people will have seen before, but I'm going to try to go quickly.
Absolutely.
Quickly through at least the introduction. So again, recap through the materials that I'm sharing, and because I'll speak pretty fast here. Let's see. So, sharing screen, there we go. Okay. Right on. So, I'm a visiting fellow at the Ostrom workshop, and also I lead the Open Referral Initiative, which is developing new means of coping with a very old problem known as resource directory information. I worked in the field at an organization that provides many services to people in need. One of the services that we provided was information about other services for our clients. We maintained a database of services to which we'd refer people to. And this is because it's actually very difficult to find this information. It's hard to quote unquote see the safety net. And specifically in this context, we're talking about a data domain that is specifically around which organizations provide what services, where are they located, how are they accessed. Really quickly, there's all kinds of reasons why this problem is actually very hard, harder than you would expect, harder than a normal market of information about services. In large part because organizations, this isn't even on this slide, but organizations that provide services to people who don't pay them for those services don't have strong incentives to promote their information to attract more customers, right? They're often not paid by their funders per person they serve. They're often not paid, even when they are paid per person, it's not enough to cover the costs of the service. So on top of the fact that the information itself is very difficult, it's complex, organizations have a lot of different services in different locations. They have different eligibility criteria. They might describe those services in different ways to different people. And on top of that, they don't really have strong incentives to go to anybody else's website and say, here's all the things that I do. And I learned that because I worked for an organization in that role. It was my quote unquote responsibility until somebody told me, you don't have to worry about it, right? And so there's a whole field of intermediaries that collect this information, many of which were conventionally nonprofit call centers. Now there's an emerging field of web startups who are, in large part, to some degree, scraping the websites of these old nonprofits and repackaging them into commercial products that they sell to healthcare companies and so on and so forth. At this point, they say, oh, we're not scraping, but it's basically this emerging situation in which you have more and more sources of competitive and less trustworthy information. This is what that sort of looks like, is essentially a proliferation of sources that are all collecting redundant sets of the same information. Real quickly, you can see this is just an example of like 3 different directories have the 3 different names for the same organization, and only one of the directories actually says like, this is specifically what you need to know in order to access the service during intake hours, which are like Monday through Thursday, 8 to 5, right? Everything else, is overlapping sets of the same thing, but it's deceptively difficult to actually get users what they need. And so what we call this is essentially an anti-commons, or at least I believe this is essentially an anti-commons when you have multiple parties that all claim the rights to the same resource, which ends up with it being essentially under-delivered, right? And what we have here is like more and more supply of the same information, but it's all managed in different and ultimately proprietary databases. And so you have more and more supply, but it's not meeting demand, right? There are less and less trustworthy and sustainable sources of information. I'm going to skip some of this. The vision that we developed, which at first I felt was like a pipe dream until I found the work of Eleanor Ostrom and the work of the Governing Knowledge Commons world and developed some of the language and the logic to figure out how could we actually instrument a strategy to pursue this vision. But the vision is basically the same information should be accessible to people wherever they want to look for it, right? Wherever they want to use it in many different ways. Not as an app, but as essentially a utility, right? As infrastructure. And this is our very simplified version of what that would look like. At this point, I've presented this to the Ostrom workshop many times. To be clear, Open Referral is not building the infrastructure itself. We've developed the language and some of the blueprints and some of the components for it, but we help communities figure out how should this infrastructure work, because the answer to that is going to be dependent upon their local institutional landscape, their local circumstances and needs. So I'm going to skip a bunch more slides here, but the important thing is until very recently, we did not have much in the way of specifics about what that infrastructure would look like. And now we've been developing just not only conceptual frames, but now visual aids and hopefully soon planning tools to develop these new understandings of how you can align multiple different channels of information around the same sources of data. Actually, one more piece of context. Open Referral developed what are now data standards, right? So we have now worked with the industry associations to establish interoperability potentially, in that all the different technologies that serve this field are now expected, and many do, and most are at least saying that they will, to use the same standards to be able to share information more or less frictionlessly, rather than having to do a custom integration every time you want to share information from one system to next. We've now established interoperability, but that doesn't answer the big question, which is who's going to sustain the maintenance of this data that we want to share, right? If it takes resources to be able to make phone calls, to be able to produce reliable information, because people like me essentially can't really be bothered when I'm working at an organization that's really busy and doesn't really have strong incentives to go to anybody's website. Who's going to make them phone calls? How are they going to get paid? How is that labor going to be sustainable? We have to answer that question. And so in this paper that I just shared through partnership with the Ostrom Workshop, reviewing the literature, learning from other fields, we developed this sort of typology of different possible models. So to work through this a little bit, and then we'll dig into each one, what I call, there's one axis that says, in one column, you have intermediated sources of this information, and then the other, you have direct sources of this information. And on the, I think that's y-axis, I always get those mixed up. Canonical sources of information, meaning official source of information, or co-produced, meaning collaboratively produced sources of information. So the canonical intermediating model is one organization that maintains, quote unquote, the single source of truth of all the information available in a community as a service, like a data utility. The direct canonical model would be an official register, an official list of all the services provided in a given domain that organizations are supposed to update themselves, presumably because they are required by an authority to do so. So we call that a service register. And then the co-produced model is co-production being the work that's done among the beneficiaries of the work, right? The users of this knowledge resource are also the ones who produce it, and they work together to do that. And that's what we could call, in an organized form, a data collaborative, or a federation if you are being fancy, when you have many intermediaries that are working together to share information. And finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, the crowdsourcing model of users on the internet, presumably co-producing this knowledge directly. And like a wiki. And that's actually where I started, by the way. 10 years ago, when I first was wrapping my head around this problem, I'm like, let's just get data from every website and put it on a wiki, right? And we'll just have people, will just start using that, right? The wisdom of crowds, right? Here comes everybody. That's essentially what I thought we would do. And it was actually the social workers that I was working with who were like, I don't think that's going to work out the way you think. And I'm like, you don't understand technology. It's magic. The internet is magic. And it was actually a big mess. We tried it and it didn't work at all. Many others have tried it, and I've never seen it actually sustain. I've seen a few wikis that sustain long enough for like the one person who like really believes, it sustains as long as they keep it going. But it's not, it turns out the crowd is not magic. The crowd will not assemble. This information is complex. It's nuanced. It's only held by a handful of people, right? And so you can't really expect the crowd to just be magic. We have to have institutional designs, which doesn't suggest that we shouldn't leverage the crowd for some things, but I think only as an input to one of the other three models that we have here, right? I don't think it's a strategy in and of itself. So I want to get into these specific models, but before I do, I'll just pause. Before we get into each of these specific models and the diagrams that we have there, I'll pause to see if anybody has any questions real quick. How am I doing? Only 15 minutes in, doing good, great. Okay. No questions? None yet. Okay, cool. So what I wanted to be able to do, because it's one thing for me to like be able to describe these conceptually in ways that I can link back to the concept of club goods in the case of a data utility, or a common pool resource in the case of a data collaborative, or a public good in the case of a service register. I want to be able to like help people who actually have to be involved with the management and administration and maintenance of any of these systems. I want to help them to be able to understand this stuff at a glance. And unfortunately, people don't read. So having visual aids can be very useful. Because in a lot of instances, I'm working with communities. What we try to do is work with communities to figure out how can you move from where you are, which is probably a bunch of competing silos, to a future where there's arrangements that enable the sort of cooperative allocation of resources that are currently being thrown at competitive siloed endeavors. And having these models in mind, as long as everybody can understand them, helps us figure out how do we go from here to the future, right? In ways that are valuable each step of the way. Because we're not going to be able to build the whole system all at once that solves this whole problem, but we can find specific steps forward that can be valuable in and of themselves and enable us to take on more and more complex arrangements. So what I developed in dialogue with the Ostrom workshop, with their support and in partnership with the designer, are these diagrams that sort of show a potential sort of systemic, repeatable arrangement of data flows and actions and people. We tried to keep it pretty simple. It's still pretty textually reliant. Not really sure how to avoid that. What I like about where we ended up is that we can show sort of tiered and cyclical relationships among different actors. And so in this, we have help seekers on the left. They're looking for information probably from intermediaries. So we've sort of like simplified a whole vast field of different places, social workers, hotlines, websites, et cetera, who are intermediaries, referral systems, we've called them, who themselves could get standardized open data from what we call a service register in this case. And the service register, it's probably only going to work if it's established by an authority institution, probably, but not necessarily a funder, an authority institution who can require service providers to participate. So we have a funder who gives funds to service providers. It doesn't need to be funds, it could be licensing. An accrediting agency could require this, but says, as a condition of doing business with us, or getting funding from us, or being licensed, you have to update your information in a service register. And what we've learned from experience, and this would not be surprising to the Ostrom, people who studied the Ostrom school, is the mandate is not enough. You need a custodian, you need someone to monitor, right? And so in this diagram, we like the most important point that I always have to bring when we're talking about this model is people want automated solutions. They want a silver bullet. And the most important point I was trying to demonstrate here is you still need a human who's going to be responsible for maintaining the accuracy of this information, right? Because even with a mandate, it doesn't mean organizations will comply. Even if they comply, that doesn't mean they're going to be sharing useful information. Right? And so the data custodian ensures compliance, ensures standardization. And in theory, we have a self-perpetuating system. And in the back in the top left corner, the additional incentive to the funder, other than just like making information about the services that they fund easier for people to find and use, if this information is available as open infrastructure, as standardized open data, and this whole ecosystem of referral systems are all referencing that those same presumably uniquely identified canonical open data records, analysis, metadata of the usage of directory data can be aggregated, synthesized across channels so that you could compare on the hotline versus on the website versus in the hospital, who's asking for what services on some level, right? What are the patterns of requests? Where are the gaps? And so on. So this hypothetically enables that data-driven decision-making that everybody talks about, and as far as I can see, nobody knows how to do in these fields, right? That said, this model, even though on one level it's hypothetically valid and we've done tests to show that it works in the field, at best, you can get a funder here, a funder there, maybe some authority, and maybe a government here to participate, but this is, especially in a decentralized system like the United States, this is not going to solve the problem at scale. So we need other methods. So this system is what I call the data utility. And we might be rearranging this a little bit. In some ways I can speak to after, but to walk through it again, help seekers turn to referral systems and other third parties who can access data that's being maintained by an organization that employs and trains and pays a data custodian to maintain all this information. The data custodian on behalf of the utility is the one to actually go out and collect the information from service providers. And the question here for this model, and to give you some additional context, for an average metropolitan area, you're talking 2 full-time employees at least. to maintain all this information. You're talking at least 500 to 1,000 organizations providing thousands of services. And let's say each record takes half an hour to 90 minutes to maintain. That's years. That's a year of work, at least for, for a small town, right? And so the question is, how is that labor going to be sustained if this information is going to be available as open data? And what we found, both by doing market research and by analyzing other data economies, is that the open data is tactically helpful to, foster adoption, but most intermediary organizations of any significant size, like a hospital or a government that might leverage data from a data utility, they're going to need a guaranteed level of service. They want to sign a service level agreement. They probably want value adding features. So the data utility can provide its core asset of open data for free, and that actually expands the number of organizations that are probably going to want to pay it for guaranteed levels of service, guaranteed uptime, guaranteed update frequency, ticketing, tech support, training, reports and analytics, white labeled websites. There are all these things that organizations would pay for in association with the data. And by having this diagram, we're able to hone in on that dollar sign in that top left quadrant and design our projects so that they are asking, what are the services that our community, that our market actually wants to pay for? And how does the utility develop the capacities to deliver those services on top of resource data management? So this is essentially, if I'm understanding, a club good model, right? Where the basic open access infrastructure is subsidized by premium goods available to paying customers. Any questions about that? Okay, so even if this is successful and we have demonstrated the plausibility of this hypothesis through various pilot projects, we have not finished fully evolving any organization's business model to become essentially a new kind of operation as a data service provider, right? But we have demonstrated the plausibility of this hypothesis. But even if it's successful in a city, you still have the region around it, right? Even if it's successful in a state, you still have the region around that. This, just like the register, is not in and of itself a solution to this whole problem, right? They can work together, by the way. It's very likely that a funder, remember this one, it's very likely that a funder or a government agency that makes contracts wants a service register to exist for its services that it funds, but it doesn't want to be the one to deploy and be responsible for it. So the registry model can be a service that the utility provides, right? For a funder, the utility can say, we will deploy and monitor a register of all the services that you fund. We'll provide you the data, we'll provide you the analytics, right? And that's a service that it can generate revenue for. But even that, the big question is, how do we build the federating capabilities, right? That would enable many intermediaries to share resource data together across essentially a cooperative network. And so this is this looks like the busiest slide, but it's actually the simplest, even though this is the most complex challenge, right? It's, service providers at the center, a network of collaborating data custodians with federated information systems that share data. And you can imagine this as, a network that includes utilities and registers and so on and so forth. And in many instances, in most instances, this is the capacity that we're trying to build to at scale, but understanding the particularities of the other two modes is important to be able to build this, right? These are great tastes that should taste great together. And it's most likely that the federation or the collaborative will succeed if you've figured out how the business models, the operational models on those lower levels are going to work, or what they would need to be able to work. So I can walk back through really quickly and show you one last thing that I like about these, and then we can take some questions. I think the biggest innovation of this whole project was, in addition to these complex diagrams, we realized we should just provide haiku for each of the models. So in the top left, for each one of these, you have a haiku that conveys the whole big picture. A register is a self-updated list, authority requires it, monitored for trust. A utility is one steward maintains, open access database, pay for premium. A collaborative model, a federation, shared responsibility, mutual benefit. So, how'd I do on time? All right, great. Real quick. So I know I breezed through that. There's more context in the other videos and resources that I shared. I'll just close on this. And I'm excited because we have some folks in the room. It's one thing to imagine these things out, in an ivory tower, and I really value my time at the Ostrom workshop. But we really only solve these problems by applying these ideas in the field. And that's the work of essentially building capacity, learning and iterating, and revision over time. And that's like getting people together to talk, right? All of these ideas involve various stakeholders who have common interests, but they have different perspectives, different languages. And the thing that I brought to this space that I think a lot of technologists really failed at was technologists, their culture is often like, you build first, right? You shoot first and you aim later. And I'm like, actually, we should talk to each other, which is different from the culture of technology development, which I think undervalues conversation and overvalues sort of like, doing and action. You want to balance, but being able to bring people together and talk about these things, having the tolerance for it and the skill to make it actually like something people enjoy, I found that turns into a rare and precious asset in these conversations. And I think that's what we need more of. And especially more facilitation skills that brings with it the theoretical framework, and essentially a praxis from contexts like the Ostrom workshop. So I'll stop there and looking forward to hear what people think.
Actually, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Oh, so hello, my name is Jongmin. I'm a PhD student in O'Neill School, and this is amazing. I think it's a really great idea, but I would probably want to hear more about, I see the slide that talks about local pilot. So I might want to see how they actually implement it in the real world. And at the same time, I think I follow really well till the slide 20 and 21. And then when we reach the federation, the third one, yeah, I kind of lost it from there, and I was like hard to kind of visualize how that interacts. So that would be really helpful if you can give me some more context or other example that you have implemented.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I have some examples that I can give of like a federation and of like a register and a utility. For example, in Florida, we built a register of all the services funded by the Florida Bar Foundation, right? All the legal aid services. So there is one funder that funds almost all of the whole domain. And then all of those organizations, because their funder required it, they all use the same software system. So within that software system, using these standards, we developed a tool to solicit information and publish it to every other user of that system. And then it can publish it externally. And those organizations, because they all know each other and because they're held accountable by their funder, they serve as self-monitors. I don't have much to, I could dig up some images to show of a screenshot, but it is difficult to sort of like show it. But that's an example of a register, and we have others. In DC, we have a coalition of 60 organizations. We built a database. We said, please update your database. We monitored how many did. We went the rest of the way, right? Because only 30% of them, these are organizations that all said, we want to cooperate on this. But when we built the database, only 30% of them actually logged in and fully updated their information. We were able to go the rest of the way because we had a custodian that was able to monitor and verify information as it went. With the utility, we've had project, I can share a link to the Miami Open 211 project where we sort of did the market analysis for the utility. And that lays out the specifics of the, here we go, the specifics of the business model as we anticipate them. As for the collaborative, yes, that slide is like, there's very little specifically going on there. And I am in the process of like a design sprint that's like figuring out what are the rules and processes and incentives that would actually get multiple organizations that are currently maintaining redundant information, that have clear interests in cooperating with each other, but have all kinds of barriers to trust, barriers to cooperation, friction, and so on. We're trying to figure out what are the tools and rules that would facilitate that cooperation. Because many times we've seen organizations get to the point where they say, we want to cooperate, they start sharing data, it's a mess, nobody knows who's responsible for what, and it falls apart, right? And so we are in the process of figuring that out, and that's the next great frontier. And once we've done a decent job of it, I can put this problem down and move on with my life, I hope. So, okay.
So in the federation part of the model, we don't need external fund, or also can we use existing database for this?
Yes, good question. So yeah, the federation model, I guess you're picking up on, there isn't like a dollar sign in there, right? And that's not to say I don't think there should be financial incentives. I'm not yet sure exactly what they should be, but presumably this system hypothetically is sustainable because the intermediaries all benefit from cooperation, right? So they all want to contribute in order to be able to get that data back. But the question of how to facilitate that, how to go from hypothetical cooperative value proposition to a real one, that's what we're in the process of figuring out. And yes, practically speaking, ideally, it's a proposition in which you bring your own information system, whatever it may be, as long as it can speak the standard language, and you can plug into this cooperative network without having to change your system, abandon it, use some other system that you don't control. The vision is that this could be essentially distributed data management with some level of autonomy among the nodes in that network. All right, so there's a line of questions. I think Jamie might have been first.
Well, thank you. And thanks for sharing this cool work that your working group has produced. That's just, yeah, it's quite an accomplishment. You can tell there's a lot of hours, a lot of thought behind your project. So kudos. Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak more to the technology usage patterns of the help seekers that you're hoping to serve with this database.
Yeah. So, I mean, here's the thing. I don't think human-centered design, as it's commonly known, sets us up to deal with complex problems in society. I think human-centered design that says, define your user type and figure out how to meet that user type's need, it doesn't really help us when our user types are every possible human in need, right? Elders, youth, undocumented residents, people with disabilities, right? Like there are different user-centered designs that would have to accommodate what you might call the last mile for each one of those. And so a lot of what Open Referral is trying to do is find supply-side solutions in infrastructure that can enable those like end users to be better served by people not like me, who better understand how to deliver information to them, right? By the way, I think I think that's solid, but it does make this very difficult to fundraise for. And it makes it very difficult for us to recruit like people who are trained to think in terms of user-centered design to participate, because they're like, wait a minute, we're talking about data custodians and we're talking about infrastructure, like, where's the user? Shouldn't we be helping the user? And I'm like, obviously that's why I'm in this work. But if you start by picking your user, I'm not sure you can back yourself up into a solution to this information supply problem. So, you know, look, cell phones are pretty ubiquitous, you know, smartphones are pretty ubiquitous, right? But that doesn't mean an app now works to get this information to anybody. Practically speaking, most people in need, the technology that they use to find this information is other humans that they trust. right? It's a librarian.
That was a big
social
question of
worker,
mine.
It's a health care provider. And so the question is, how do we get this information into all the different places where people who are helping people in need might be? Whether that's Google or an electronic case management system or electronic health record systems, right? Our pilot projects are we try to work with the intermediaries and figure out how to get this data flow to work for their systems by aligning, ideally, the people who are already laboring to produce the data in the first place, just not in ways that are like, designed to distribute that data across all these different channels.
So your goal really is to support the people, to support the information flow from human to human, basically.
Yeah, so this took me a year to figure out, that the initiative that I was like, I think we could start this. Open Referral's primary user is a data administrator. It's a database administrator, right? We want to help people in need. We want to help service providers. We want to help researchers. But the person who's going to use Open Referral's products is a database administrator, right? And that was an important aha moment that helped me clarify things. It also was like, wow, I'm never going to raise any money to do this work, because who wants to help database administrators? The closest I can get to a pithy way of explaining this is I tell people that I help the people who help the people who help people find help. That's like the best way I can explain what it is that I'm doing. And I'm not sure it really works all that well, but Brian. Hi, Brian. You might still be on mute.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have some things about Commons. If there's time later, or if you're staying on after one, could talk about. But I guess the question and comment I'd ask now is, in a sense, I was trying to think, what is this like? And to follow on what you're talking about just now, what does this look like to a user? And off the top of my head, I was thinking, okay, like a travel website, Travelocity, Kayak, where, okay, I want to get a plane ticket, but it turns out they'll help me rent a car and find a hotel and a bunch of other things. And so that's both, is there, and maybe you have a better analogy for help people think about it, and, in dialogue with what you were just saying, to me, it really seems I get the point of a lot of users and use cases, but if you had kind of one killer app, one driver use case that might attract the funders, whether that's I lost my job or I'm in a divorce, or maybe there's another case that lets you then build out from there as a strategy, or in terms of thinking through, how this works for users and the people who are trying to get them served.
Yeah, so again, that's why in those diagrams that we showed, the help seeker is interacting with referral services, and we don't get into the details there, right? Like, we are trying to improve the flow of information to intermediaries who then help the help seekers, right? And there are already call centers, there are already apps, there are like there's no shortage of channels to deliver this information to people. And we're not trying to compete with those channels. We're trying to improve the flow of information across all of those channels, right? But to speak to your question with one answer, the way I had the reason I had the chutzpah to get started on all this was that in 2013, a small team at google.org, working through an initiative called schema.org, proposed a standard schema for web markup, for information published on the web to be tagged in ways that search engines could recognize it as structured data. They proposed a schema specifically for civic services. And I talked to that team. They had no adoption strategy. They're like, well, nonprofits are going to, when we tell them about it, nonprofits will go to their websites and put these micro format data markup tags on their websites. And that way their websites will have better search engine optimization and they'll get more users. And I'm like, as someone who manages a nonprofit website, there's no way anybody's going to do that. Right? Like, that's just like, there's so many reasons why that's not going to work. But they put the schema out there, right? And I was able to use that to bring all these other intermediary organizations who were competing with each other to the same table. And to say, you all have common interests, you're currently locked into competition, And guess what? Google is coming down the road. I bluffed a little bit. I said, Google's got a plan. Do you want to be a part of this plan up front, or do you want to, be chasing after it afterwards? And everybody wanted to be at the table if Google was there. And we developed Open Referral to say, we need a common data exchange format that could then be translated into this standardized web markup, because most people are going to go to Google, even though we know that many service providers have other tools that aren't going, like, they're not going to, like, they'll use the website if they have to, right? They'll use Google if they have to, but ideally this data could be supplied to them through their tools, through their case management system, right? Through their electronic medical record system. And what we're saying is, like, these don't need to be either or decisions, right? If we find infrastructural solutions, we can provide this information through many different channels, such as Google, Yelp, et cetera, and also through care providers' own systems, improving their ability to provide care. Okay, maybe last question, and then we can talk about the data commons framework. Christina.
Yes. Because my question is not directly related to your research, but it made me really curious when you mentioned that the wiki model doesn't work. So do you know why does it work in the case of Wikipedia then?
Great question. I mean, I think so. Wikipedia, I think the story of how it got going is really interesting, and I'm not sure that that's a replicable phenomenon, right? I think one reason Wikipedia is successful is that the scope lends itself to the crowd, right? They're saying, here's a clear scope, a clear set of rules, right? Around what is knowledge, right? But then once those rules are set, anybody can contribute knowledge, right? If it's notable information, anybody can contribute it, right? Which on a global level turns out to work really well, right? A central compendium for knowledge. Once they reach critical mass, that becomes the place that people want to go to contribute knowledge. In our world, when you're dealing with resource directory information, a lot of that is like, this knowledge is like this needle exchange program operating at that church, which has a food pantry, but partners with this other organization to operate the needle exchange program, and it's only available on Tuesdays at 3 to 5 p.m. Who has that knowledge? Like, a couple dozen people in the world have that specific knowledge. And so a wiki is actually like, the long tail is, it doesn't, the calculus don't really work. Maybe I should get better language to explain this, but it's like, it's much harder to reach that critical mass around a trustworthy source of information when that information is super hyper local, right? And I think we've learned this in other fields. Local wiki was like a big potential phenomenon, and it really only worked in 1 or 2 places. In like Davis, California, the local wiki is still going. Every other local wiki project that I'm aware of didn't really pan out, right? I think you can look at the successful crowdsourcing projects, and they all have alignment between the scope and the community, right? Like, successful crowdsourcing projects are largely like wikis that, other than Wikipedia, that I've seen that work, are like fandom wikis, right? Where there is a defined set of knowledge, and a lot of people have that knowledge, and they're going to find that wiki, right? And they're going to contribute like information about like this Pokemon's, evolutionary, change from this to that. But that's knowable information. Everybody who likes Pokemon can have access to that information. It's, and like they can contribute it. Whereas this information changes all the time. It's often very nuanced. Different people will have different ways of describing it. And so a Harry Potter wiki, you still might have flame wars in a Harry Potter wiki, but there is the text of the Harry Potter books, right? Like, you can just, there is a canonical text. And so the wiki can be the canonical, accumulation of fans' narrations of that canonical text. But in this world, with this knowledge, it's a lot more delicate. It's a lot more contingent. And it's a lot more hyper-local. And so it doesn't really lend itself to crowdsourcing, which is not to say that the crowd can't contribute valuable input. It's to say that I think, based on what we've seen, we need those intermediaries. We need established institutional designs to be able to receive input from users broadly and process it in a reliable way. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect transition.
Great. So, Angie, I've been talking for a long time. I
Yeah,
don't.
go for it. I think it's important that, this is recorded as, because this is a toolkit
Yeah.
specific to some of, the conversations about those models.
Okay.
And, I honestly can't say, often enough, I am the person who says I hate the phrase working groups because they never actually do work.
Yeah.
And it's not true in this instance. There's a
Yeah.
small but mighty group who are actually working. So I would love that you show
Yeah.
some of, frame it up
Yeah.
and show at least some of the governance model that is begun.
Okay. So, I was super excited to find the Ostrom workshop and the community, the Bloomington School, and so on. And I started coming to these events. And what I found was a super helpful set of frameworks for researchers and theorists and analysts. What I wanted was somebody to tell me what to do, right? I wanted somebody to be like, yes, we see your problem. Here's what you should do about the problem. I still don't have that. And I've come to accept that, like, that's not going to come, right? It's not going to happen, right? These are, especially when it comes to like emergent resources, right? Where these are new commons, that we don't have the luxury of empirical data that can be like, here's what makes for a good rule. We have to figure it out as we go. But my question then remained, once I accepted that, nobody knows what to do, really. The question became, can we take these well-established principles from governing the commons and the governing knowledge commons research framework, translated those principles into a set of questions for researchers to ask about existing commons to be able to analyze it? And my question was, can we develop a different version of that is a set of guiding questions that reference the principles and help communities apply them to their context? And we found, actually, right around the time I was asking this, and I was working on this with some folks who are working on new modes of sustainability for open source software. And we had just done this work of translating Ostrom's principles and Silke Helfrich's translation of those principles into statements that would resonate with open source software maintainers, right? Where the same ideas are relevant, but you do have to use different language. The jargon does not fly, right? Like open source software maintainers, they don't like the sound of rules, but norms, agreements, they're like, yeah, sure, we could do that, right? Like, so you have to we wanted to figure out in the software context, how do we translate these into language that will resonate? And then what are the questions that we can start asking to apply these principles without telling people what to do, but helping them think, right? Giving them the tools to help them think and the questions that can help them think. And right around this time, Ada Lovelace Institute came out with a framework that analyzed data commons and tried to translate the Ostrom principles for common pool resource management. And I know folks from the pilot projects that I'm working with, they might not be familiar with those principles. And I can follow up with y'all and talk through this if you're interested. But in this spreadsheet that I just shared in the chat, you can see on the left side, these are the original Ostrom principles. And what we've been doing is thinking about what are questions that can guide communities in the application of these principles, even if they never learn the jargon, the original jargon, even if they never learn the whole framework for governing the commons, can we hand them a set of questions that they can use to think together about how to govern their resources? And what we've got here is, we went through each principle and started thinking, how does this show up in a data commons, right? And then we're iterating on it potentially. You can see a second tab where we're experimenting with identifying a set of layers of data commons, right? Because commons are not just one thing. It's not just the data, right? It's the brand, it's the information storage, it's the mailing list, the documentation. Those are all parts of a resource sharing system. And so in addition to developing these questions, we can think through, given the most common aspects of a commons project, how do you apply these questions at that level of that resource, like these principles in the form of questions that are relevant to that particular level? So again, this is just a draft, but we came out with, something that I think is worth banging around. And, as I'm going through in partnership with projects like the ones who are on this call, when we're thinking about like, what questions do we have to answer in a data federation? Sometimes I do go back and reference these to think through, which questions haven't we asked yet that might be helpful to us as we try to figure this stuff out.
Do you want to do a quick share screen in case somebody can't click the link? And then I was also going to say, this particular specific work, it almost chokes me up that we've been able to do this. And this is a labor of love by a bunch of people, these particular guidelines. Greg is very much responsible for those models that, we use as sort of the underpinning of conversations. But you are some of the first people to actually see this. There'll be more and more push outs about these questions, these frameworks that, this toolkit, I suppose, that's been developed. The group wants tons of feedback. There's none of us that would tell you this is complete or perfect or anything like that. It's why it's getting pushed out. I do, every time we talk about officially pushing this out, a lot of places take a deep breath and swallow hard in case, somebody's mean to us. But this is, I can't say it often enough. This is a working group who worked. And this stuff is pretty impressive. I think it's also important to note it was a diverse group, not just diverse in sort of the traditional use of that term, but diverse in thought, diverse in large institutions versus, the little mighty, people who are like, I'm doing this on my own. And then you get these big, massive institutions that I don't want to throw under the bus today, on the recording. And we had some proper, I'm going to go with disagreements. Being the nice term.
There's still things that I want to.
Everybody's like, go to your own corner. We'll do it. We'll do it in the show doc.
There's still
Angie,
things that I
not
want
just
to. There's things I want to change in
contestation.
here. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say not disagreement, contestation.
Sure.
right.
Yeah, Greg, there were multiple. Yeah.
And I'll give you an example of how I'd like to see this evolve. Right now, these questions, a lot of them are yes or no. And for example, I think we can make this more useful by reframing these questions, although it'll take a little bit more work, away from just like yes or no, and to let them be more guiding open-ended questions, right? Instead of, are there rules about how the data commons is funded or supported? A question like how will the data commons be funded or supported, and under what conditions, right? And that shift from like yes or no, is it present or not, like that may reflect the shift from taking this from an analytic framework where you have like, people being like yes or no, check the box, to an applied governance process where it's like we want this question to start our conversation, right? And a yes or no doesn't quite set us up to start that conversation directly. And so there's ways that I want to see this improve and would welcome your feedback as to how else it could be useful.
We've thrown a lot at people. So if they're skimming through this right now, that's a big ask. I will say, because I do see we're not terribly far from the top of the hour while we wait to see if anyone unmutes. This working group has come to sort of its natural conclusion in theory. Because when I start working groups, the idea is, we all sort of agree to sign up for sort of a deliverable. And this came out of the data salon, and we delivered every 3 weeks, a different group or entity that had tried to build a data commons and the struggles they've had. And we used all that information. And then for the most part, over the summer, these were drafted by a small but mighty group. So, now we would be looking to add new members who add different things, or, sort of next steps. So I don't mean the working group will end. The deliverable that the working group was working around is in a place that we're comfortable with it to now, ask for feedback and reiterations and all types of stuff. So part of the reason to have this and this opportunity today is to pitch this out to more people, because there's always a chance that, someone's doing something brilliant in between the data salon and the data working groups and stuff. We didn't get you in the group. And, that's just amazing opportunity. The other thing is, we will begin to, test this, right? That's sort of Ostrom 101, is to come up with these ideas and then to actually put them out in test places. There are some pending projects and stuff that are in the works or walking down a path where they will be in the works. And, that will also inform the creation of these and, some editing and some review of them as well. So, just to give everybody sort of that pitch of, I've just honestly never been in a working group that actually does work. And this is an amazing group of people that have come together and been brave enough to argue with each other in a respectful way, of course, and throw research and all kinds of stuff into we won't say argument, and to build this and the more the merrier at this point for the most part. I mean, 100 people, like polycentric stuff would be difficult, but I see Jamie has a question.
I do. Of course, through you, I've become exposed to the idea of open government data. And so I was wondering if, these design principles would be applicable to those kinds of situations too. I mean, we talked about it a lot in the context of nonprofits, but yeah. What about like government?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's in open referrals context. When I came into the space, I was under the assumption that like we just have to find the government database somewhere where all this information is being kept and not, effectively published. And it took a while for me to really like accept that like actually the government is not producing this information, so we have to figure out how to do this ourselves, right? But in a lot of cases, the government is producing data, and it's just a question of how do you reformat it to be more accessible? And maybe these aren't as relevant in that case when it's more of a public good where the government is just doing it. Although there are many cases in between where the government could be producing better data, but it's not just a matter of reformatting it. It's not just a matter of putting it on a data portal. They might have to figure out internally, how do we cooperate across institutions to produce better data? In this case, even though it might happen entirely within the government, you can still use these principles and this framework for the public servants who have to figure out how do we, essentially align around new ways of cooperating in order to produce better information, right? So this stuff is fractal. It can be applied hopefully in any number of contexts. I'm so glad that I had folks from our pilot projects joining. It was great to see y'all. Dean, thanks. I see you there in the chat. I'd welcome any questions that the folks from the pilot projects have about the technical stuff we talked about. And likewise, if any of you on this call from the Ostrom workshop who are listening in for it, if you're interested in getting involved in some applied data governance, please let me know.
If people are, of course, we always stay a little bit. I don't know if you're able to do that, Greg. But
it's for 5 or 10 minutes, but I'm actually developing a proposal for resource data governance system that's due tonight at midnight.
We're all doing the same thing. It's like, hold on, I got a project proposal.
Ironically enough, right? This is so exciting, Angie.
Yeah.
And Greg, really, really cool stuff.
Scott, I think you've seen me talk about this like 4 or 5 times. Is it getting better?
Each time it gets better and better and better. It's like Groundhog's Day. No, with the happy ending. This is fantastic. Congratulations to both of you guys, everybody in the group. And speaking of, we're continuing kind of a Knowledge Commons theme a little bit next Wednesday when we're going to be celebrating the publication of a new edited volume that Brett Frischman, among others, edited. And our colloque speaker from Monday, Michael Mattioli, has a chapter in that, as do I, and it's all about privacy as Knowledge Commons. So that could be a fun chance to continue aspects of this too.
And I've been seeing some great contributions in the chat. Charlie and Brian, thank you for those. Brian, I think you're right. D Hawk's story about Visa does seem really relevant. It's been on my list to dig in, and thanks for the nudge to get it up my list. And yes, Charlie, David Sloan Wilson's book on pro-social, that's definitely sounds like something I'd be interested in reading through.
So Greg, my balloon men behind me are cheering you on. This is
Yeah.
fantastic work. Really great. It was really a pleasure hearing it. Yeah, just keep going. And I've really enjoyed talking with you in the past, and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks, Ostrom Workshop. This was great.
Yep. Okay. Brian, I see your hand non-digitally raised.
Yeah, if you have a few minutes, couple things, I'd be interested.
Yeah, real quick.
Yeah. Okay, so one, just quickly, and this is more off the top of my head, except I did hear an earlier talk. I think in terms of club good being a way to think about that, that seems to make sense. In terms of anti-commons, I think technically that's not the problem here. Anti-commons is if you end up excluding, and especially if multiple, kind of owners or rights holders have ways to exclude that makes it so difficult, therefore, to get permission to develop your drug or use your property in Moscow or whatever. The other part on anti-commons is that seems to be, though, also the potential danger that all this with wonderful, great intentions, all of a sudden you end up getting the information somehow locked up or hard to access except to the people who are paying the premium, and that doesn't work. And in this lovely federated way, it's like the problem with access to legal code. Basically, somebody's gotten the authorized rights and implicitly shuts others out, even if in theory it's supposed to be accessible.
Yes. So, I mean, I think, first of all, when I looked up anti-commons, I found, references to sort of like material resources or spatial resources or sort of knowledge resources that weren't necessarily like digital data. And I did wonder if there's a digital anti-commons may have somewhat different properties, but the reason I'm calling it an anti-commons is you have many organizations that collect the same information. And if they were cooperating with each other and sharing that information, the supply could meet the demand. But because they're all collecting the same information, none of them are quite able to have, essentially a critical mass of good information, but they're trapped in all these different silos. Some of them are in explicitly proprietary silos, right? Where they say, this is my information, you can only access it from my website.
Okay, but that's a basic cooperation problem. They'd all be better off cooperating. Or what we talk about loosely is a social dilemma, and I could get a bit technical about why we need a broader definition of social dilemmas and not just the tragedy of the commons model. So it's, everybody would be better off sharing, but it's hard to get there.
Yeah, but I mean, it's
the other thing, I think, given your time is limited, I'm going to push again. I really think it would be worthwhile to come up with some example of what this is like. And I take it in terms of who you're saying, these administrators you're seeing as your users, but then something that talks about the back end and some persuasive story of back end, which could be Visa, it could be the bank clearinghouse, it could be the travel agent. The history behind that was American Airlines and Sabre, but some story that the back end got worked out for some reason and then became something that had these returns to scale and grew. It might be a way of people getting a sense, oh wow, this is really worth putting some money behind.
So you can take a look at our blog. I didn't cram any of those stories into here, but stories like that, that's the currency with which I make my way, right? We have pilot projects. Again, nothing's really fully sustainable and viable at scale, but we've had small projects that have worked where we're able to say, here's how this organization saved $250,000 without having to rebuild a website. Here's what their website is. You can redeploy this website. Here's a free open source tool that you can use to manage a directory and then push that data into other organizations' websites. We have a lot of different examples like that. We don't have like a killer, app yet.
I think just referring to one of the killer apps that people don't appreciate what it took to create the back end might help too.
Yeah. But Brian, I'd like to maybe keep talking about the digital anti-commons, because I know it's not, there is some conventional elements of that where it's like many organizations have this data and they treat it as their property, right? And as a result, it's undersupplied. So there are plenty of organizations who might collect this information and not be proprietary about it explicitly, but because they're collecting it in a Word document or they're collecting it in an internal database that's not even online, it may as well be proprietary. It may as well be siloed off, you know, with rules, right? Just the formats essentially are, in that case, the rules that prohibit cooperation. And so if we want to solve that social dilemma of what I think is essentially a digital anti-commons, we have to make it easier for them to cooperate with each other than to not cooperate with each other. And that involves, you know, finding ways to maybe not entirely tear down the silos, but make them permeable, and find ways to align those resources that are currently competing to produce redundant information in a way that can be collectively rationalized, so that maybe some organization has responsibility of maintaining this subdomain of services, but that organization has responsibility for maintaining that subdomain of services, and they cooperate with each other. Anti-commons hypothetically.
Okay, if you wanted to correspond, I have to because you know, from reading Heller and hearing him talk and so on, you know, my interpretation of anti-commons really is, you know, too much exclusion as opposed to just the potential for active exclusion. People who have barriers and would prevent other people from using something unless those people come and get their permission.
Right.
You know, that,
I mean, that does happen in the, it's, you know, the nonprofit organizations say, you know, they put disclaimers that are not legally enforceable, but they put the disclaimers on their site that says, you can't take this information off our site, right? And the for-profits that, you know, they say like, this is our property. Again, it's not legally enforceable, but it is happening.
Okay, yeah, that starts to sound more like an anti-commons. Yeah.
We were missing that information because I was tending to think along the same lines as Brian as well until you said that. So yeah. Well, again, I mean, isn't that amazing how that one little piece changes the perception of the scenario? Well,
and I get that, although I've come to learn that it's only one layer and not even the most important one, right? It's like I think that anti-commons label may be useful if we can understand that it's not just in that specific thing where there are rules prohibiting, right? Like you have multiple producers of the same resource and the resource is undersupplied, right? The more producers you have, the less supply, the less reliable supply there is, because you have more and more sources of the same information. In other words, here's another way of doing it. I'm at an organization and I get one directory asks me for my contact information and my service information. Maybe I log in and do it. When 4 organizations ask me to update my information in their directory and I have to do it 4 times, I'm not going to answer any of them.
Okay, I'm just saying technically that's an efficiency suboptimality problem, not an anti-commons problem, as opposed to people actively putting up barriers.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not sure if that, I'd love to talk to Heller because I'm not sure that the distinction holds.
Contact him.
Right? Because like suboptimality and efficiency are aspects of, you know, the anti-commons problem, right? Like the fact is you have more and more producers of the same information. They hold the information and they're competing with each other. So.
Maybe is that a governing knowledge commons take on an anti-commons?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I try in the paper. I call it this, like I specify this in the paper, like this is a digital instance of that phenomenon, right? So, but I'm not saying I'm definitely right. I just think it seems like the same problem in a different context. So. And another thing, I mean, again, like understanding the problem, even if it doesn't meet some very specific technical realm from the original context in which it was drafted, it's really helpful to be able to apply these ideas in new contexts. So
Okay, I'm capable of getting worked up on that because part of what I'm working on is trying to understand the extent to which defining things as the Tri-Choose Commons or prisoner's dilemma
right,
makes people miss the fact that there are other important cooperation problems, stag hunt and chicken kind of hawk-dove conflicts being the most prominent examples. And
Yeah.
it traps people's thinking with as if there's only one model, and actually there are several other important models which can be either much friendlier for cooperation than would
Yeah.
be expected, or have a different underlying dynamic.
yeah.
Yeah. So
Well, yeah, I mean, look, this is it's drafted in the paper. I can't say it was peer reviewed. It was Christy Swiney and Sheila Foster reviewed the paper and said, this looks good. This makes sense. But I would welcome, suggestions for how we might more appropriately frame the issue based on
yeah.
based on what we
Well,
have.
there I'll get meta because I have a chapter in the same book from the same conference and so on. And just the example of, Cambridge Press claims copyright over that thing you put that link to,
Right.
is, that's an obstacle and interference in
Yeah.
some ways of an exchange that we would happen to think would be, very desirable.
Yeah.
And there's, they make it more difficult than we would like to share because we basically have to back up to our submitted draft for something we're free
Right.
to share if we want to post it publicly. So,
Yeah. And it seemed, look, in the chat, we have Peter from one of my pilot projects who does specify that the dynamic that he experiences on the ground are multiple competing proprietary claims to the same information. So
yeah, but those are transaction cost problems. They're not.
multiple competing
Okay.
proprietary claims to the same resource seems like an anti-commons problem. But look, I'd love to better understand. I recognize that, I'm trying to use the literature for practical purposes, and maybe, strategically, I take some license in order to make a point that, I could see others could quibble with, but so far it's been helpful in helping people understand, because the information, since it's not all in one place, it's not a commons. The information's being managed in many other places, right?
That's
And
the
part of the
cooperation. You're creating commons, something.
Right, but the way to describe it,
optimal.
do I just describe it as a cooperation problem, or can I say this information, which, it's all the same information, but it's being managed in many different places with different organizations that claim it as their own? It seems like I can describe that as an anti-commons problem in a way that can help us then say, what would a commons look like? Right?
It's a failure or an opportunity to create a commons
And
that's being obstructed by a bunch of things, or if you want to loosely call it a social dilemma, people just following their individual incentives, they're not going to get there to the cooperation.
I agree.
Whereas
And I
you
think
as
you
an
can also call
entrepreneur
that an
can help.
anti-commons, yeah. But we should talk to Heller.
I contact him. I mean,
Okay.
yeah. So